All right, so thank you everyone that has joined us today. It's good to see familiar faces and have a chance to join together. We've got Alex Pentek here with us today from Cork, Ireland, and he is going to share about his practice and kind of go a deep dive on a few pieces. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Take it away, Alex.
Sure. Thanks, Jerica. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So Jerica asked me to come and talk to you all about kindred spirits and some other public works that I've been working on recently. And she said she shared a brief bio about me and what I do. So in the slide presentation that I'm going to get into next, I didn't really give a background about me, other works, or sort of history of other things that I've done. I've kind of just really focused on 3 projects. So, but just a little bit about myself. So I'm an artist based in the city of Cork here in Ireland. And I work making large-scale public realm work, but also gallery-based work and making temporary installations in folded paper. And at the moment, I've gone back to college to study an MFA, Master in Fine Art in the Contemporary World at National College of Art and Design in Dublin. And I'm studying the fold as a site of transformation. So this is on a sort of number of levels. And maybe if we have time in the chat afterwards, if anyone's interested, we can kind of get into that. So what I'm going to do for the presentation, there's 3 projects that we're going to look at together. And I haven't just shared the sort of glossy pictures of the work finished in place, or there's some of that, but I've also included images of the work actually being made, you know, images of the work being constructed, some of the methods that I use, and also some of the design kind of thinking behind the work, you know, to kind of try to kind of get into some of that. You know, I thought that might be interesting for a distinguished arts audience such as yourselves. Also, then outside of the technical side of things, to get into the more conceptual thinking behind the work, as well as what I've wanted to talk to you about and share with you as well. So there's sort of 2 elements to the presentation. So we're going to focus on 3 projects, and I think we'll just get into it. How does that sound? And then afterwards, so the presentation itself will be about 45 minutes or so, maybe a bit less now. We're kind of into our time as we go. About 45 minutes presentation, and then we'll have about 15 minutes Q&A afterwards. So if anyone has any questions, we'll keep it nice and informal. We can just, you know, I suppose while I'm presenting, it might help if people turn off their microphones. But then after I finish the PowerPoint, we've looked at those 3 projects together, then we can kind of unmute and we can just have a big old kind of chat about things. And hopefully we'll get to every question, you know, hopefully people will have some questions anyway. So let's get started. So I'm going to start sharing screen now. So hit that, share, and this, and now, sorry, bear with me. Okay, brilliant. So the first piece I'm going to discuss is a piece very connected to your state of Oklahoma. This is Kindred Spirits, and this is a piece of sculpture I made in Ireland, not far from Cork City, actually, in the town of Middleton. And it reflects on the 1847 donation to Ireland from the Choctaw Native American Indians, or First Nation American Indians. And so, you know, this is a huge part of history, and there was a brief that went out for artists to respond to this specific history. So we're going to get into how I sort of came up with this idea. And the first slide here is actually thinking of the symbolism of, you know, where I was going with that. And the reason why I've included this is because thinking of the history that it actually brings up. Firstly, there's the Irish famine, or the Great Hunger, as it's known locally here, because of course there was no actual famine in Ireland. There was plenty of food. It just didn't belong to the poor people. Then controlled by Britain, food was shipped out of the country. And it was the poorest of the poor, who was subsistence farmers who were depending on potatoes, who were affected. And of course, 1 million died of starvation here, and many other millions emigrated. There's that tragedy. And the level of that is sort of huge. I mean, it was described by one reporter at the time by the name of Townsend, I think, that the graves were walking. I mean, this description of people as walking graves is just off the charts. But then there's the story of uplifting humanity and kindness coming from the Choctaw Nation, who heard by word of mouth of what was happening. And it's sort of piecing the pieces of the puzzle together. It sounds as though they sympathized with Ireland as one oppressed nation to another, because of course we know the Choctaw Nation were, disenfranchised, moved from their native lands around the Mississippi up to what is now your modern day Oklahoma. And during that move, 13 years previous, I think it was 1831 to 1833, known as the Trail of Tears, you're all very familiar with, I'm sure. Thousands of Choctaw died during that. They were hit over those years with really severe weather. So there was exposure. People died of exposure. People died of malnutrition and hunger. There was a cholera outbreak as well during the whole thing. So, I mean, they were kind of hit with everything, basically, and it was awful. And I started thinking, how does it feel if your family members die in front of you and you're powerless to help them? And I realized very quickly that that was kind of really beyond my imagination, that some things are actually beyond imagination. So I thought of symbolism, and the word is very, very interesting. You can see here, it comes from the Greek sun to mean with, and Greek balein to throw. So what's that about, right? And I researched this many years back in art college. There was a nice library there, and I found this one book that unpacked this idea of symbolism and where this word comes from. And basically it relates to a tradition of ancient Greek times where two merchants would strike a deal. They'd have a shard of ceramic. They'd smash the ceramic by throwing it on the ground. Each one would keep a half. They'd go off and do whatever business they had agreed to do, whether it's golden fleeces or whatever they were dealing in. And they'd come back, and to sign off on the deal, the two shards would fit together. And of course, only those two shards that broke originally would fit together to complete the contract. So a very clever, simple way of making a unique bond between two parties. And of course, what that meant was that while one shard of the ceramic was in your possession, it symbolized the existence of the other half that was somewhere else or unknown. So it's an interesting word, that one thing can symbolize another that's kind of not there. So that was my approach to this piece of work, and to make this symbolic work. And I created the image of a bowl, an empty bowl, to sort of represent the Great Hunger and the million who perished in Ireland, but also the round-tipped eagle feathers used in Choctaw ceremonial dress, and to create this sort of fusion of ideas. But to actually visualize that, I used SketchUp 3D modeling and made this quite rudimentary kind of basic visualization. But I find that, visualizing work in space, in situ, even though it's a bit computery and pixelated, it doesn't really matter, that people still got the idea. And this communicated the idea clearly enough for me to be selected. So it was open competition, and I was lucky enough to be selected for this. So then I made a paper model it's my own back garden here. And, this paper model, just to kind of try to see it in actual space, it's helpful to visualize things. And I often work in paper and card just to kind of visualize things that way. But then came the fun part of actually making the work. Originally, I thought I was going to laser cut these veins of the feathers from 10mm plate, but there would be too much heat and too much warping apparently, and it was problematic. So I ended up kind of just biting the bullet and chopping up a lot of square bars and spacing them with these offcuts to kind of give this, this kind of uniform spacing. But there was another problem. That was that basically each one of these veins, there's about 150 veins each side of each feather, so 300 veins per feather. Each vein requires 6 welds, so that's about 1,800 welds per feather. And then there's a whole lot of other welds in the feathers themselves, the stems. Basically it means there's about over 20,000 wells in the entire work. This isn't one of the feathers being rolled, it's another piece from another sculpture being rolled, but just to show the large rollers that are here in the sculpture factory, which you can see behind me in the background. This is the space where the feathers are actually made. So I'm zooming here from the sculpture factory. Yeah, so I rolled the sections and I made one feather just as a sort of test to see, well, does this even work? I got large pipes rolled in the UK and I tapered them myself here in the studio space. Here you can see my studio space here. So this is an open artists facility for artists to come and make work. So no one's here permanently. I just come in and out to do the large scale projects. And we're very lucky to have it actually in the middle of the city of Cork. So once I'd made one feather, I knew that it actually worked, that it was going to be okay. I was getting excited. But that excitement soon kind of faded when it turned into 9 of these feathers, and the amount of work. I mean, it really was a year on my hands and knees with a welder in my hand and a sanding pad in the other. So I got some help with some art students who'd recently graduated from the local art college, the Crawford College of Art and Design. And so I kind of built a small team and we all polished and hand finished these. So it's good to have that help. And here are the finished feathers in the space just before shipping out an installation. And a funny thing happened while it was being installed. Here you can see the fixings and the base plates on the foundations kind of down at the bottom here. Basically, a couple who happened to be from Oklahoma visited and saw the work being installed. They asked, could they take images and share it on Facebook? They did. And it sort of went viral. And so even before the work was even completed, it had been shared and done the rounds on social media. So it was curious how that happened. And then I got contacted by Chief Gary Batten's office to thank me personally for remembering our shared history, which I thought was like amazing. I thought, wow, that's really cool. So it was great to have that connection, which I shared with the local council who commissioned the work, Cork County Council. And so I said, well, why don't you invite Chief Batten over for the official launch? It took a couple of years, but basically eventually in 2017, Chief Gary and his council members and friends came to preside over the official launch. And here you can see me kind of grinning ear to ear, being presented with a handmade Choctaw seal, which was a great honor. And there's the Lord Mayor on the very left. And so it was a great day. There was over 1,000 at the launch event. And there was, there was just a great reception. And one of the things that happened then was the then Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, visited Chief Batten in Oklahoma on an official visit. And so there was a fellowship, actually a scholarship set up between Ireland and the Choctaw Nation. And here's the first recipient of that fellowship, who came over, and I think we're on number 2 or 3 now, who come to visit Ireland as a place to study and to kind of, just to kind of create this cultural educational exchange. So that was a nice legacy, a part of the legacy from the project. But there were lots of other spin-offs too. And, I think creating awareness of this shared history was exciting for a lot of people, including myself. And I was asked to talk at a Harvard talk a couple of years back with Chief Batten and Ethel Billy Branch, who you will know from Navajo and Hopi Nation COVID funding. She was the amazing person who set up the COVID fund and raised millions and saved hundreds, if not thousands of lives on reservations that were underfunded and not really looked after very well during COVID times by the authorities. So, she really did some amazing work. And it was, I think a lot of funds came from Ireland to this GoFundMe page. And I think that the feedback was that there was an awareness of this Choctaw-Irish bond through kindred spirits and through sort of publicity surrounding the work. So it's interesting how awareness of things kind of shifts and moves, you know, across the ocean and over the sort of social media outlets. So, and here's a nighttime view of the work taken by Brian, I'm just trying to think of his surname, Martin, who's a drone operator living locally and a photographer, and he took some wonderful drone footage. So thank you, Brian, for that, for these images. I'd never actually thought of looking at the work, you know, from this angle. But the work kind of also, as it was being made, you know, if I just go back slightly to some of the sort of the making of the work, it became very much like a mandala in steel. You know, there was so much actual physical labor to make the work that I wanted to kind of imbue the work with honesty and I think a genuineness. You know, materials kind of communicate visually. They speak their own story of their own making, I think, in a way. You know, when we look at an object, we can sort of see how it's been made, or if someone has done this by hand or by machine. So I wanted to kind of give a genuine sort of human touch to the work. And then as people walk through the work, you know, there's a blurring of boundaries between the context of the landscape and the feathers themselves, which become actually quite architectural and solid when you get up close to them. They become less delicate and they become more, you know, chunky. So there's a few sort of things happening with the work, which I was, I'll put my hand up and say I was very happy with, was pleased with the outcome. So, so that's Kindred Spirits. And the next piece I'm going to talk about is a piece I've just completed just last year, last August, it was cited, a piece that reflects the amazing life and achievements of Charles Hamilton Houston, who, of course, we know is the amazing Black activist who is sort of credited with almost single-handedly sort of taking down the Jim Crow laws of racist segregation in states. And his story is amazing. As I researched, and again, this was an open call, an open competition, as I researched his life and found this quote where he said that the hate and scorn showered on his Negro officers by our fellow Americans convinced me that there was no sense in my dying for a world ruled by them. I made up my mind that if I got through the war, I would study law and use my time fighting for men who could not strike back. So these are really, really powerful words. And here is Houston as a second lieutenant field gunner in the First World War in France and Germany. I mean, living hell, right? And also experiencing racism from within the ranks of the American Army. Like, it's just a very sort of a bleak place that he must have been experiencing, you know, these experiences and this prejudice. But reading between these lines, I kind of thought that actually there's great brightness and hope in these lines as well, because despite the weight of the racism that he's experiencing and the hopelessness of the First World War, you know, the first mechanized war where, you know, a machine gun like the Vickers machine gun was designed to turn a line of infantrymen into a red mist, you know, it's just off the charts, horrific. And there he is talking about really equality, unity, of integratedness, not hatred, not retribution, you know, but of unity and kind of, you know, helping those who couldn't strike back, you know. So the piece I created for this is titled Unity. And I wanted to, again, symbolize the idea of an integrated world and of, you know, also a kind of connection, you know, and a global sort of theme. I'm placed at this elementary school in Washington, D.C. The story of racism, as you are, I'm sure, very familiar with in Oklahoma and in the US and across the world, unfortunately, is an ugly one. It's an ugly story. And to try to depict this in some way, or to try to address this, or even to sort of, you know, approach it in any way artistically without being literal or without being sort of crass or depicting representational sort of awful things. You know, that was what I wanted to avoid, basically. And then, of course, we have the whole colonialist sort of thing where, you know, public spaces and statues like the Colston statue in Bristol was torn down, and many others across the States with the Black Lives Matter movement after the murder of George Floyd. You know, like an incredible time that we're in right now of change, or at least of the desire for change. And so where you have these colonial statues of representing figures, you know, solitary figures, I didn't want to create something that would communicate with that legacy and history. So I didn't want to make a representation of Houston, a sort of literal representation. I definitely wanted to avoid that. And it's a tricky area, you know, it's a real challenge from an artist's perspective, because we think, you know, visually, and we like to communicate emotionally as well, and historically, and there are a whole load of levels that we work on as artists. And so I wanted to kind of try to get into this that didn't need a whole load of text, that didn't need a whole load of words and concept written behind the work. And the other idea was, you know, thinking of young people in particular. I mean, the world as you know, we're living in today, ultimately is going to be inherited by them. So I wanted to kind of give this idea of ownership to a younger audience, that the world is yours, you know. So this globe, this sphere, it's a perfect sphere, symbolizes that. But I also got into the geometry and maths, which I'll talk about a little later. Now, here's the actual piece. That was the montage that I created using SketchUp 3D modeling and Photoshop. Here's the piece actually in situ. This was created by Red Pepper Forge in Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. They're an amazing outfit, creating artworks in steel, large scale work. And only by working remotely with them, because of course this is in lockdown, this is during COVID that this was made. And so I had to work completely remotely, which meant actually giving a very detailed list of fabrication sort of methodology to the team so that they could make the work as quickly as possible without losing money, because time is money when it comes to fabrication. So here you can see the allium flower. I never actually mentioned the allium flower, what this represents. So the allium in florography, which is the idea of flowers having certain cultural, spiritual meanings. It's quite a Victorian thing, but it goes back older as well to other cultures around the world, that different plants have different sort of significance and meaning. And the allium, I learned during my research, signifies unity and staying true to one's principles during times of adversity. So I thought, how amazing is that? This tells the life of Houston, you know, of like going through adversity and staying true to his principles, which he did, and of kind of hoping for an integrated world. So while the real flower obviously isn't as perfect as this, I created this perfect sphere of, I think, 460 flowers. And you'll see the very middle flower here is 5-sided, but the rest are all 6-sided. So it's a mixture of 5- and 6-sided flowers. So the next problem is, how do you do that geometrically? So here's an image that I used in my 3D model. The image on the left is an icosahedron. Or let me think, is that right? Is that an icosahedron? Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, so basically we got 20 equilateral triangles. It's one of the platonic solids. There are 5 platonic solids. And so it's like, it's a cool geometric shape, but it fits inside a sphere perfectly. And you can see that on the right. It fits inside the sphere. So then what I did was each sort of triangle of the spheres is a sort of slightly domed triangle sort of shape. And I'll show you what I mean by that, because I was able to then divide the sphere into 20 of these. Now this actually had to be worked out quite technically, you know, by kind of coming away from the middle flower and then extending outwards. So there was old school sort of graphic design or draftsmanship here. I was glad I paid attention in technical drawing classes in school, because it's really helped me to work out the geometry. I had to work out this geometry to then give this to the laser cutters in DC to be able to cut the pieces. And this is what they did. So here's 20 sides all cut out. They arrived in a box and into the studio at Red Pepper Forge, and it looked actually quite unimpressive. You know, it's like quite small and stacked together. But what you might notice here is that the flowers don't actually touch here at the edges. Ever so slightly, there's a gap or a distance, and that's been calculated so that by the time they're brought together, it's domed the whole shape. And that meant that the whole thing could be domed in sections and then welded to these rods which connect to a central sphere. So all of this had to be worked out beforehand. A bit technical, sorry if I'm going off on a tangent on the technical side of things. Here's one of the workers in Red Pepper. So you can see then the detail, it was bead blasted. And I kind of wanted to really create this sort of, I think this experience, you know, that would be beyond words, and also that would communicate mathematics to a younger audience, because mathematics is just, it's one of those wonderful subjects. I admit straight away, put my hand up high, I was lazy in school and I should have taken maths more seriously. I mean, I enjoyed maths, I was okay at it, I didn't struggle with it. I could have pushed myself a bit more though. After I left school, of course, then I realized I love maths, right? So slightly obsessed even, you know, and so mathematics is a fascinating subject. And I wanted to give this sense of wonder and joy of mathematics, which sometimes can be seen as a boring subject or as a sort of one of the subjects that young people might not particularly warm to. You know, it's like a chore almost. You know, you got to work stuff out, use our brains. But I wanted to give the kind of joy of maths and to link maths with nature, of course, because, you know, once you pick up any flower, right, or any naturally growing thing, there's maths involved straight away. The mathematics of growth, the Fibonacci series, you know, which allows spirals to occur in nature without distortion, you know, which we have, you know, in the human ear, the cochlea, the spiral of the human ear, to conch shells and nautilus shells and everything else that we can see in plants and nature around us. So these maths are kind of at work behind the scenes everywhere. And I kind of wanted to give that to a younger audience, just at a visual kind of level that might captivate people and maybe get them to try and count how many of these that there are, or how does the geometry work out, or, you know, probably I would say, I'd hazard a guess, without having seen the previous image of the icosahedron fitting into the sphere, it probably wouldn't be very obvious the underlying geometry of this sphere and the underlying geometry of the laser cut flowers. So you got a sneak preview of that, but it's there, that geometry is there. And it's, you know, it actually only through that geometry was this possible even in the first place, that by using those things, those systems that I didn't really invent, you know, I'm just kind of piggybacking on other people basically to do that. You know, the thinking was already done for me with the icosahedron. So again, I suppose I'm a lazy mathematician, I guess is what I'm saying. But the thing, one thing about maths in particular that I find fascinating is, and I'm keeping an eye on the time here to see how we're going, is that with maths, you know, we have numbers like real numbers, like pi, 3.147, you know, goes on, right? Endlessly. Is it 3.142? I can't remember. Anyway, it goes on. It never stops, okay? That number actually never stops. So here's the thing. If you're an architect and you want to build like the Duomo in Florence, you know, a giant hemispherical dome, you can do that with 3.14, basically. That'll do it for you. You know, you don't need to go all the way down to the end of that never-ending real number. So what's weird about that for me is, this is, I guess I'm just trying to understand this, really. This is my problem. I'm sharing here. Basically, what's weird for me is that that number is endless, but we don't need it to be endlessly accurate. We just need the bit that we need to use in the real world around us. You know, we just need a chunk of it for us to be able to move some materials around and do something physically in the world that we inhabit. I think that's pretty cool, because there's like weird levels of maths going on forever on one hand, but then there's just chunks that we need and can understand in human terms on the other. I get a buzz out of that. Anyway, okay, I'll stop going on about that. So yeah, here's a piece just to show another image of the work outside the school in situation here. So yeah, it's kind of communicating with the environment as well. And I didn't get any nice images of the shadows, but I think I calculated from the 3D model that I made, the shadows are going to be pretty cool as well. You're going to get these nice complex math shadows on the ground as well. So that was that piece. And I think that's been received very well. We still haven't had an official launch yet, so I'll keep you all posted. So the final project that I'm going to share with you is a piece called Discourse. This is our constructivist poster that Larissa O'Grady, musician, created for us. So this is one of those weird things that happens just out of the blue for me. So, you know, as artists, we're probably quite used to working alone. I know I am sometimes, you know, unless I need, you know, help. But generally it's, you know, you're making something and you're controlling. And of course, speaking for myself, I'm a control freak. I like to be in control of things and to make them happen the way I want to. So when you collaborate and work with other people, then there are other voices and it shifts the dynamic quite drastically. But it's also really, really liberating, and I'd thoroughly recommend it. I think the thing about collaboration is to ask, why are you collaborating? I don't think it's enough of a reason just to be friends with someone. Not that I don't love my friends, but you know, Larissa contacted me. She made contact. She come across my work, and she's a musician, a classically trained musician with Crash Ensemble, which are an amazing avant-garde classical music group playing modern classical sort of works with a twist, I suppose. And so she's a violinist, and we wanted to do something. You know, I started straight away talking about folding things, and we got excited. And then she pulled in a friend of hers, Sam Perkin, who is an amazing composer, but also an ex-skateboarder. So Sam, this is some of the images of the work being made, a model I made for this, but just actually, I'll just stay here for a second. Sam basically is one of those amazingly talented people that we meet along the way. And we all decided we'd collaborate together. We put in for some Dublin City Arts Council funding to create an event, an artwork event in response to the end of lockdown, the end of COVID. And also during COVID, who were the worst affected, you know, people and demographic of this. And we decided that it was actually young people, particularly teens, that sort of demographic, because, you know, when you're that sort of age, you're building your friend groups, you're on the phone, you're learning about yourself and your friends at this opening up sort of stage in life. And like the past 2 years have been pretty hard, I think, on that particular group. We have a 16-year-old girl at home, and, you know, so, you know, it's, I think, been a very tough time for that group in particular, and other marginalized groups such as the skate community. And Sam being part of that, although he doesn't skate anymore, but is like really well known and respected in those circles, knew that this is a community that is pretty much ostracized by society. You know, I mean, there's anti-skate hard. I mean, I don't know, perhaps we can talk about this afterwards, if there's anti-skate furniture within Oklahoma to stop skaters skating on benches and things. You know, nobody wants the skaters, right? I mean, there are very few cases of people being injured by skaters. You know, no, it's just this sort of like, keep the young people away, put them in a park somewhere out of the way where nobody sees them, you know. So what we did was, here we're in Meeting House Square, a very central space in Dublin city centre, and we created a work. Sam composed an amazing sound piece, and we'll share a link to that sound piece afterwards. And basically, it's a live performance with the pre-recorded elements to it and this folding structure. So that was my challenge as the artist sculptor, was to create this folding form that's using a reverse fold, which is an origami fold. Here's a model I created here at the Sculpture Factory in my studio space. And this basically is folded wood so that it could fold down on itself. And so then the next challenge was making the actual thing. Now this is a slightly blurry image, a still image from an amazing film that Nestor Romero Clement made of the work and the sound performance. And we created this work where basically I was unfolding manually the work using a series of car jacks, and inadvertently became part of the performance. That wasn't the original plan, but this is the way of folding down the work safely. And I ended up becoming part of that actual performance by doing this. So I'm compressing the work slowly as the piece is taking off. And as it compresses, you can see there's a manual aspect to that work. I was kind of pumping those jacks to get them down. And then as it collapsed on itself and is kind of more braced and lower, about sort of 400 mil high, we had 3 amazingly talented local skaters from the Dublin skate community. And they were just like amazing. And they loved the piece. And we had it mic'd up as well with contact mics. So as the piece was folding down, these guys came along, Michael McMaster and let me think, there was Pete Buckley and Anthony Thornbury. Yes, I remember their names. And they were amazing, just so talented. And they completely finished the work by skating on the work and creating this sort of sound response that was echoing and sort of, you know, vibing through the whole courtyard as they were grinding off it. And there's brass inserts that I put on the work, so it was, you know, good for them to kind of grind off. That's about the end of my skate terminology. Sorry about that. But yeah, they completely loved the work. It looks really difficult, and I imagine it actually was really difficult to skate, but they loved that because, you know, normally it's like a bench or a bar or a curb, which is easily accessible. But this is like you had to get up high and get on it, and they just did it. And here you see, this is, I think this is Pete. You know, it's like ballet, you know, they just move so gracefully and effortlessly. It looks effortless anyway. They make it look so easy. And there were just these moments that were captured with the stills actually that we saw. And I love that shot. You know, it really is so dramatic what he's doing with his arms. And we were quite happy with ourselves standing around afterwards at the very end of it all. And Sam there on the left, you see, is playing a skateboard with contact mics, and he composed a piece, and we think it might actually have been the first piece ever composed to be played on skateboard. So, so he played skateboard by making different sounds and noises, and Larissa was doing wonderful sort of responses with bending notes on the violin that just sounded so haunting. And we were pretty happy with ourselves afterwards, and of course with the skaters too. We had a celebratory beer afterwards. So so this is working in the public sphere in a different way, and it really comes back to something I believe in with the work of Hannah Arendt, actually, who was a political theorist post-war, an amazing woman. So cool. Any video you see of her, she's got like a cigarette going and she's kind of dressed stylishly and speaking so beautifully about the public realm, about responsibility, about our role in society and our responsibilities as individuals within society. And I think most upliftingly, she speaks about the public realm as a space where we can have agency through voice in particular, and that actually our voices are controlled a lot more than we think, without getting into the sort of the philosophy of Michel Foucault, who talks about power quite a lot and very beautifully as well, and how we are sort of subjugated to various forms of power in society. But what she talks about, Hannah Arendt talks about, we can have agency through voice, and that our voices are generally controlled. We're not to shout. We're not to display unusual behavior in public. Usually, you know, there's a lot of limitations about how we are and how we express ourselves in public. As individuals as well. And she says that actually it's through voice and through our communication in public spaces that is our agency, that we can speak together and have a united voice. And very interestingly, she says that before we can actually have agency, before we can even talk about an issue or try to address something, that firstly we have to find our voices. Because once we've found our voices, then we can actually use that as a group to talk and to put something on the table that might need to be changed in some way. And so I'm fascinated by these ideas of the public realm as where this can happen. And this is a quote, slightly obtuse quote by Albert Camus, who was, you know, really the father of absurdism and was great friends with Samuel Beckett, you know, the famous Irish playwright living in Paris during the resistance and occupation by Germany. And the sort of absurdism of Camus is that, you know, he famously wrote his work on Sisyphus, the myth of Sisyphus, who was, you know, rolling this boulder up the mountain endlessly. That was his kind of task. That was his punishment given to him by the gods. It would roll down again and he'd have to roll it up again the next day, endlessly, this futile, pointless task. Sometimes, I don't know, can anyone else relate to that? But, you know, he talks about this banality, you know, underlying everything, and that we just have to get on with it and accept things sometimes and just keep moving. But he wrote these words, that the procedure of art is the same as the procedure of rebellion, which is to resist the real while conferring unity upon it. And I think that this is really speaking to ideas of rebellion and of disruption, you know, that sometimes it's important to disrupt, but it's not flying the black flag of anarchy. It's also saying that, yes, we're disrupting, but we're disrupting for purpose. You know, we're disrupting because there is a community of difference, even, you know, that if we see things differently, we're viewing that as a community, seeing things differently and individually. And these are really exciting ideas. I think I should probably stop there and open up to any questions and answers, and I'll stop sharing. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much for sharing about your practice. It was great. I loved it, especially that last piece. That was really interesting. I'm married to a skater, so I get to hear about skating all the time, and in particular complaints about the anti-skating hardware that they put on all the benches and everything.
Yeah.
So we actually did a gallery. This is not related. I'm just sharing a story while you all think about your questions. But a few years back, we did an exhibition in a gallery on, I think we called it mark making, where we took skateboard decks and hung them so you could see the underside, like hung them on the gallery wall. You know, the idea that like this is a record of, you know, every trick that they had done, and that this is an art form. You know, and looking at the collection of marks that were left as being sort of interesting. I don't know that anyone really connected with it, but we thought it was a fun exhibition.
That's great.
Yeah. So I'm gonna open up the chat and see what we've got.
Oh, yeah, I just
here.
shared.
Okay, that was you.
I shared a link on the chat just with the sound work as well. So it's a Vimeo link, but it's not like an open Vimeo link. You need the password Discord, capital D, Discord. So you can kind of check that out. I think it's about, is it 9 minutes maybe? I can't remember. hopefully you'll enjoy that, and we can share. It's on the website as well, on my website under recent works. But yeah, so Sam's composition is there, and Nestor's wonderful video, and he filmed that. I think he was so conscientious about capturing all the details. Such a gifted filmmaker. He filmed everything in, I don't know, I have the right term here, perhaps someone can help me out, but he filmed it at double speed, double shutter speed, so that basically everything could be made slow-mo, you know, so he could just slow stuff right down if he wanted to, or, you know, play at actual speed. So he kind of left that open for himself, but it meant that he had like tons of footage, you know, in terms of data, you know, like on his camera. So it took him a bit longer to get through, but yeah, he got there in the end. Anyway, that video is there, and the sound work is there. Discord with a capital D is the password. So hopefully you can enjoy that in your own time.
Great, thank you for sharing. Does anybody have any questions? You can unmute and chime in.
I have a question.
Great.
Hi, I am curious if you recall, because obviously you're a very big time artist doing really great work for the community. I was wondering, what do you think the hugest difference has been from your first public artwork to now with these big projects?
Well, that's a great question, Ange. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, great question. So, you know, I'm gonna answer that question, and I'm actually gonna answer another question as well that comes up over the years. You know, as I've met people and artists, you know, coming up from college and wanting to get involved in working on a large scale, or, you know, making work in the public realm, even just on a smaller scale. And they asked me, you know, how do you work on a big scale? How do you get funding for a bigger project like that? You know, I want to kind of jump in at that level. I want to kind of get in there. And to answer that and your question, Ange, I mean, I started my first public, actually back in college. Now I'm thinking guiltily. I actually was, I made a commission while I was still a student in college. So that would have been my first official commission. An architect who came and saw my work wanted something that I'd made the previous year, but that I wasn't making this particular year. So I made this, actually a large scale, it was a female bust, stylized, and in steel and concrete, I think it was. And I made the work, and then like covertly shipped it out of the college and got it to his place, you know, and the tutors asked the next morning, where's your work, you know, where's this piece of artwork on? I said, oh, I threw it away, I didn't like it in the end, you know. And so that was that was that. Yeah, that was the first work I made while I was in college. I went a different direction actually during my final degree year, working in ceramic on a smaller scale. But to answer your question, like really, I worked on a smaller scale. So my first publicly funded commission was actually, I worked in wood for that, and steel, a mixture of wood and steel. And, you know, I created a series of other smaller works that were limited in budget and scale, basically. But with each piece that I made, I was kind of learning as I went, you know, and that it kind of enabled me to think a bit bigger the next time, and a bit bigger the next time. And so I sort of built up slowly, year by year, a portfolio of work that was gradually getting larger and larger until I had to move into a place like this. But no, but I was lucky to have this, you know, as an arts community. This is the National Sculpture Factory, so it's for anywhere in Ireland can come here and work and apply for space and come and work. So it's an open artists facility funded by the Arts Council of Ireland. But you know, I just worked on smaller scale works until I could kind of build up some sort of credentials and portfolio that I could use as backup for applying for bigger projects, which I then built up and then could use as backup for applying for other projects. And it sort of was really a a snowball process for me. But, you know, that isn't to say that that's the way to do it. You know, that's the way I did it. I mean, some people just get out of college and they're already superstars. I don't know how that works or how it happens, you know, and good luck to them. I mean, it's brilliant to see people doing well straight away with large commissions and large projects, you know, or large exhibitions even, you know. So I sort of worked in the public realm for 25 years. I've been working in the public realm, as well as the gallery, you know, making temporary works. But it's only recently that I've kind of gone back to study questions behind folding and something that I'm particularly interested in. So I don't know, does that answer your question in any way, or?
Yeah, it sounds like it was a gradual thing from small to large, learning along the way, which I expected, but also I have one more question about that.
Right.
Because you obviously can work with the materials you're using for your public art projects and having that amazing resource in Ireland. Is there any recommendations you might have for artists that would have to contract work to build larger structures like that and maybe don't have metal smithing experience, or a resource like that, like a metalsmith shop?
Well, I mentioned Red Pepper Forge in Washington, D.C., you know, but they're quite a bit away from you. I think I'm trying to remember now. Yeah, I mean, I think there are places in Oklahoma, because I was nearly involved in a project in Oklahoma with Jerica at one stage. And I remember looking up that there were fabrication firms. Now, I don't have that information off the top of my head. You know, I don't know. You'd have to go and look, you know, but they exist in your neighborhood. You know, there are places where you can get things made. And my advice with working with fabricators is to give them as much information as possible. The more you give your fabricator and communicate clearly to them through sketches and drawings, even, it doesn't matter if it's technical or computer generated, that's not really important. The main thing is that you're visually communicating to them information that they will need. The more information you give them, the less time they'll have to spend thinking through it all, and the less they'll have to charge you then, right? So there's a cost effect there as well. Yeah, so you know, that there are firms to do that, but I would also, I mean, just been my path. Like I mentioned working with Red Pepper Forge in DC, and that they made the work, but I gave them step-by-step fabrication instruction. Like it was a methodology. There was no stone unturned, because I could have actually made that work myself. I knew exactly how to do it all, and I was able to share that with them, which made their life a lot easier and quicker. And so that came back to save time and money for me then. So the only way I knew that was by basically getting my hands dirty and working in materials, you know, and exploring materials firsthand. And I'm a great believer in material learning. In fact, that's part of my research at the moment, material-led research and artistic research, in fact. So as artists, we research ideas through materials. And this is a form of knowledge that doesn't really fit well into academia, in that we can learn things through paint and color. I'm rubbish with color, by the way. I shouldn't even mention color, but it's where I'm a sculptor. But, you know, with mediums, you know, with different mediums, what I find is that those materials also speak to you, that they tell you things if you're listening and paying attention. And it makes me think of a great bit of advice I got actually from a jazz drummer. So I'm a drummer as well. I play drums in a blues group. And I went to a jazz gig years back when I was in my 20s. And it was at the jazz festival here in Cork. And this guy called Bobby Rosengarten, an American drummer, was in his 80s at that stage, American, and like so cool. Dave Brubeck type thing, really laid back jazz, about 5 guys. And afterwards I said, oh my God, that was amazing. You know, I'm not worthy, and, you know, brilliant. And I said, what advice would you have to give a young drummer? Now this is related, bear with me. So what advice would you have to give a young drummer? And he thought about it for a second. He scratched his chin. He said, wow, Sam, listen to the music. Right? And it sounds like absolutely nothing. Listen to the music. I mean, of course, like, duh, you know. But by listening to the music, you're forgetting yourself and you're doing what's right for that moment in time, you know, musically. And coming back to our materials, I think that if we can listen to the music and listen to materials, they're also telling us something. And, you know, like sheet metals, for example, don't want to bend in two directions at once. It only wants to bend in one direction or another, you know. So there's a geometry inherent in bended surfaces, unless you beat and pummel them, which is doable as well, right? You can use brute force. But, you know, listening to materials is crucial. And I think we can learn things through materials. And I'm sort of starting to explore that through the fold at the moment with the research study that I'm doing. So I'd say roll up sleeves and get stuck in, you know. And I think as artists, we enjoy that anyway, you know. There was one other thing actually, though, that came to mind, and this is part of the journey for me when you mentioned, you know, what's the difference between work at the beginning, you know, all those years ago and compared to now. And one thread that has maintained its way through that was a lesson I learned. I rebelled against my tutors and I worked in ceramic and clay for my final degree year, making these kind of, you know, groups of figures, which is actually a really tough thing to do sculpturally. When you group figures together, it doesn't always work from every angle. And I gave myself that challenge. Tutors hated it, but I was a bit too headstrong maybe, and I just stuck with it and I did what I wanted to do. Now they had narrative titles like, you know, Fire from the Sky or Eternal Love, or I'm trying to think of Life's Work. You know, I gave them names, but I mean, I might as well call them Bill, Bob, or Fred, or, you know, I just named them names after I'd made them because I was focused on making the work. And I felt okay about that because, yeah, I mean, I learned of that wonderful piece of sculpture by Gian Bologna, known as Rape of the Sabine Women. And it's this beautiful Florentine sculpture of this very muscular male figure with a woman in one arm and another figure draped around his legs. And it's this kind of twisted spiral form and with a brutal title. But apparently he created the work to study sculpture in the round more and then gave it this title because it fitted the theme of this kind of historic, kind of mythological event, you know. And so, you know, it doesn't matter. Like, it's an amazing piece of work. So I named these works afterwards, after I made them. And then a weird thing happened was people were coming up during the exhibit, during the show, the degree show, and they were giving their interpretations, different interpretations to the work that had nothing to do with what I had been thinking of in the first place. And I realized straight away that I wasn't qualified to tell someone that that wasn't what I was thinking, that that was their interpretation. That's kind of sovereign in a way, you know, that we bring our own interpretations to the world. And that's based on our life experience, right? So we view the world through our own particular focus, which is unique to all of us. And who else is entitled to tell us that that's invalid or wrong in some way, you know? And I think the famous art historian Ernst Gombrich calls that the beholder's share, that the beholder brings their share of experience to view an artwork and recolor it in their own way. And then I think the critic Roland Barthes, French critic, famously wrote about the death of the author. I'm sure you've heard about as well, you know, and the death of the author is the idea that the author of a book may as well be dead by the time they've written the book, because the reader will color that with their own interpretation that might be different from the author's original ambition. So a bit extreme, perhaps. I'm not sure I really agree with the death of the author or the death of the artist. You know, I think we're there too. But, you know, just the beholder's share and how things are interpreted differently is something I've kept close to my heart.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
I have a question.
Sure. Hi, Matt.
Hello. Great work. Absolutely amazing, inspirational. And hearing the background is so, and I have so many questions, but I do have one in particular that affects me, or has affected me. And that's speaking for let's say another racial group or cultural group that I am not a part of as a
Right.
white man. I was curious your position on the challenge of creating a piece for a civil rights pioneer. Did you find that this is something that should not come from a white Irishman's voice, or
Yeah.
I'm just curious how you went about navigating that, if that makes sense.
You know, that's a really great question, and important as well. You know, I mean, I think there's a saying: if you're focusing on working or making work about a particular group of people, culturally, ethnically, however way you want to frame it, you know, if you're working with a demographic, or you know, whatever you want to label that, the saying is never about you without you, right? So that you would never create work about someone without their involvement in some way. So that can be helpful. But this particular piece, the Houston piece, Unity, this is an open call, an internationally open call to respond to his legacy as a Black activist. And during one of the talks that I was invited to be part of with the Harvard alumni group, I never went to Harvard, by the way, but I was asked to speak at a number of their talks about allyship. And the theme of allyship is really important, more than ever. And the sort of point that we all agreed on, that came across through these talks, connects to this question of yours, Matt, and that is that where you have a marginalized group in particular, or a group who are persecuted in any way, that actually what's more important, or what is very important, at least, not more important, but what is important is that when people from outside that group reach across and say, hey, we're here too, we support you, we help, you know, we understand, we empathize, and, you know, and that's important, because without going across those borders and boundaries, or imaginary borders and boundaries, I'm a great believer in blurred boundaries personally. But you know, without reaching across those divides, then, you know, nothing can change. So I felt that yes, you know, I'm you know, a white middle-aged man living in Ireland, but you know, these are universal themes that Houston was working with yes, a marginalized and oppressed group of people, but that these themes are not just that, they're important for everyone, and that is an important thing. And so I guess it was my answer to your question is that I was, I suppose, really coming at it from an overall sort of humanitarian perspective, where it shouldn't really matter what color my skin is in the first place, that we're talking about things bigger than that. Does that do anything towards your question?
Yes, thank you. You being even another step away as an Irishman, I think might also. So yeah, though that helps me process this. So thank you, appreciate it.
No, you're absolutely welcome.
Okay, I know that we have run over a little bit. I might just see if there's one more question. Anyone else?
I have more questions, but
well, shoot. Matt,
well, you two might have to connect separately, but
okay,
one more.
was Kyla raising her hand? Did you have a question? Oh yeah, you. Sorry, Matt. Shoot, have you got another one?
Oh, well, I was just curious real quick, when you take on a project, like for me, I try to speak in a visual voice, so that, and I think that's not even really a conscious thing. It's just the way I, you know, express, I guess. So do you do that consciously? Do you try to create like a singular voice that, you know, someone might, you know, say, hey, there's an Alex, or you know,
All right, so
does that make sense? Or is it
yeah,
strictly communicating this story or this concept in whatever way you need to? Does that make sense?
so you're talking about style? Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah, your personal style. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question as well. I actually wrote about this quite recently in some of my own research. I was kind of pondering these thoughts exactly, you know. From an early stage, for me, I was never worried about expression. And the reason why I was never worried about expression is because I have the belief, and I have to use that word, belief, that everything we do is an expression of something from inside us, you know, that we're from the clothes we wear to, you know, how we present ourselves, to the actions we make in the world, and to how we behave to one another. All of these things are expressive of something inside, interior. And I actually think that we can't escape it. We can't be unexpressive in a way, even if we're boxing ourselves in, you know, by something. Even that is a form of expression. So I was never concerned with trying to find my inner essence to express that in some way. I was kind of more interested in sort of focusing on what's out there and to get behind the physical appearance of things. And actually, this is like a crisis I had with drawing in particular. I mean, I loved drawing from an early age, and you know, as artists, we all go through the first crisis in drawing at around age 8 or early teens. You know, like it begins with us as kids, like haptically enjoying the physical pleasure of paint or color, or you know, making some marks in some way. But then we kind of we realize that our movements are actually being recorded, right? So zigzags or scrapes or marks, or our movement is now being recorded by the medium we're using, right? So that's cool. And then we jump from that to actually a circle, 2 dots and a smiley face. Now that symbolizes something in the outside world, in the real world. So we create a symbol of a smiley face, and that's massive. Now we're artists. And then we slowly build up over the next 8 years or so, a massively growing, increasingly complex series of symbols about the world. But it gets to a point where we finally realize that when we draw a chair, we know it has 4 legs, so we draw 4 legs. But actually, when we look at a chair realistically, it might only have 3 legs, or 2 legs, or 1 leg, or no legs, depending on how we're looking at it, right? So we're confronted with a problem of why our drawings look rubbish, because we're not observing things realistically. We're not able to transpose that. It means we have to learn how to draw again. And most people give up around age 8, 10, 12, you know. And so when you ask adults who say they can't draw, that's why they're kind of like at that level still, because that's where they left it, which is funny. But, you know, as an art student, I studied life drawing. I learned to cast, to sculpt in clay, to cast in bronze, and to weld sheet metals, and carve in plaster as well. And representational drawing suddenly lost its allure, because I realized that there's a deeper reality to things beyond surface, and I wanted to get to that. And so I studied actually origami as a way of studying materials from a purely technical perspective originally. And that kind of led me on my path that I'm on today. And so now I'm kind of researching the idea of the fold as a way that not just describes surface appearances, but gets beyond surface appearances into ideas of connection and how things come into being in the first place. And I'm sorry, Matt, if I've gone off subject slightly. Your original question, can you just remind me again? It was to do with...
Well, for me, I try to speak in a visual language in a way. I don't really know. Maybe it's because I have to. I don't really know how to speak otherwise than, you know, as you speak English. I don't speak, you know, French or...
Sure.
So I was curious how you as an artist approaches that. Does everything fall into that world, or is it strictly conceptual? I don't even
Oh,
know.
no, I'm a visual person for sure. Yeah, you know, Wittgenstein, who I've kind of rediscovered recently, the famous 20th century philosopher, believed that we communicated with words to give each other images, that we're visual creatures. And so that when we communicate to one another, we're really communicating with images, but we're using language to give those images. And then the problems arise when the language falls short of the image or the wrong image is given, you know. He really writes beautifully about language. So yeah, I'm fascinated by our visual intelligence, actually. And you know the way they say like 90% of communication is nonverbal, right? Especially when you meet people for the first time. That's why it's hard over Zoom, actually, because, you know, we're just like heads and shoulders, you know. I heard one funny description that Zoom meetings are a bit like the intro to the Muppet Show, you know, where you got all these faces. But that's not saying anything about anyone here tonight, right? But like, you know, so body language, they say that 90% of communication is nonverbal. So we're reading each other's body language all the time. And that is telling us a lot about the world. And I think that materials and artworks are the same, that 90% of that communication is nonverbal, that we're tuned in, we've already judged things, we're making judgments, we're making almost, they're pre-intellectual almost, you know, they're kind of like, we've judged stuff so fast and so quickly and so efficiently that it actually takes us time to think consciously about what we're even looking at, you know, that our brains take a while to catch up with our eyes in a way. And then there's the beautiful thing that Anil Seth, the amazing cognitive neuroscientist, who studies consciousness, his TED talk is really well worth a look. It's like had 6 million views. And I was lucky enough to actually meet him here in the Sculpture Factory one evening when he was presenting. And he talks about perception not as something that comes into our eyes, like if you picture an eye and an arrow, you know, like information coming into our eyes and then being processed in a way, that picture is finished. And he says that actually it's as much creative as it is about being responsive to the world, that we predict things about the world. And so we perceive things not as they are, but as our brains and our minds predict them to be. So this is really interesting, you know, and it kind of harks back to the Gestalt rules of visual perception, you know, where we order things in proximity, similarity, and symmetry and figure ground, you know, like the classic two faces that become the chalice, you know, and they oscillate between background and foreground, you know. Closure, that's another one, like a circle of dotted lines, you know, we read it as a circle, but it's really just a bunch of dots, right? And that comes from the ability in our evolutionary times to notice that half of a tiger's face behind a leaf meant that the whole tiger was going to be behind the other half of the leaf. And those poor individuals who weren't quick enough to recognize that didn't get to pass on those genes, right? So we've inherited that ability to kind of guess what else is behind the leaf, you know. Yeah, so perception is a two-way street, which is really interesting as well. So I'm very interested in those visual things.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to have to cut this off. I'm already late for my next meeting.
Okay.
But thank you so much, Alex. This has been really fantastic.
Very welcome.
I love getting to learn more about your presentation. And maybe I can connect you and Matt can ask the rest of his questions.
Sure. Yeah.
Soon. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining, and in a couple of months.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.